Kia ora koutou, thank you for the introduction. So today I'm going to present this possibly provocatively titled paper called Listen Leftist, Violence is Not Revolutionary. And there's going to be probably quite a lot of crossover with Richard's panel, but I think we kind of come to the similar conclusion but using different research and literature and talking to a different audience. So I hope it's not too repetitive. So my paper's called this because it launches off the back of a famous essay written by the anarchist activist and theorist Murray Bookchin called Listen Marxist. And when Murray Bookchin wrote this Listen Marxist article, it became quite famous and it was very controversial. It was published in the 70s and was a head-on critique of the left, especially the Marxist left. And he challenged the left to a few things, and here I want to focus on his key argument, which is basically that means create end. And I quote, "The organisation we try to build is the kind of society our revolution will create." Bookchin's position is basically that the ends of social transformation, so a social transformation that will, and I quote again, dissolve hierarchy, class rule, coercion, and make it possible for each individual to gain control of everyday life, to make each moment as marvellous as it could be, and the lifespan of each individual an utterly fulfilling experience, is inseparable from the means of leftist organisation. It won't appear after a revolution unless we create the right causes for it. So why am I talking about this? Bookchin wrote this article in a big period of change for the left. The left was in decline. It was over 30 years since the last major leftist experiment in anarchist Catalonia. And now after 30 years of neoliberalism, in which time the left has played a largely reactive role, people are starting to think again about how the left can move forward and asking about how we can build viable alternatives. So this paper is about leftist strategy building, and especially leftist strategy building within a place like New Zealand, within Western countries. And I suppose I start talking coming from my own experience of activism over the last 10, 12, 13 years, going through international socialist Trotskyist groups into anarchist groups and engaging more and more with Gandhian groups. So my position is that we need to take Bookchin's argument seriously and think about the means of our action, which will ultimately create the society we seek. But we also need to take Bookchin's argument further. If we follow Bookchin's call to recognise means and ends in their entirety, we have to take a principled position against the use of violence in our planning action towards social transformation. Otherwise we don't have a chance of creating a non-violent society. So while some might say that this is an irrelevant debate because people aren't about to take up arms somewhere like New Zealand, I have three responses. First is, even if this is true, the theoretical acceptance of violence and of revolutionary violence still allows for violence in the future. Second, while violence is a strategy doesn't look likely here right now, there are various leftist movements around the world, like in Rojava and India, that are using violence. And leftist groups here are engaging with those ideas. And third, there are arguments for, which has been talked about in other panels, Mollis for example, about beating up Nazis. And my position is that this attitude towards beating up Nazis is effectively the same attitude as a militarised movement. It's a strategy about deleting the other rather than transforming social relationships, or trying to win by making the other side suffer more. And the logic of deleting the other followed to its full conclusion is the logic of Pol Pot, not of emancipation. It requires a mental process of making the other less than human in order to justify acts against the other. And I think we need to question where that takes us. So to understand this argument, I think we need to really consider the nature and logic of revolutionary violence. And I define revolutionary violence as enacting physical violence and therefore destroying or attempting to destroy bodies in order to create social change. So violence is generally talked about, I think in general, in the left, in a very abstract way, as if it's simply a tool or a tactical choice. And I'm taking the position that violence is an inherently authoritarian and dominating act in the extreme. You can't dominate someone more than taking their life away from you. So the perpetrator uses power to inflict death and suffering on the other who doesn't want that or doesn't have any say in that. It's the ultimate form of violation. It utterly destroys dignity. It's irreversible. It has effects on many people, not just the person experiencing direct violence. but also all those connected to them as well as the perpetrator. And the experience of violence is an experience of pain. As Elaine Scarry says, pain is language destroying. It is, in its heightened form, inexpressible, as it reduces people to a state of cries and moans. So Scarry, by pointing out what should be obvious but is often not, shows that direct violence is literally earth-shattering. It's world-destroying. It's an instigator of extreme mental and physical suffering. And overall, I think leftists' position, from where I'm talking at least, don't consider this when they advocate for violence. Violence is the unmaking of the world. It's also not simply just a tool to be picked up. It requires planning, training, weapons production, and a certain culture of violence to allow it to be a tool to be picked up in the first place. So I'm arguing the act of violence goes against leftist ideals. It's about destruction, therefore does not create the foundation, the cause for emancipation, the desired effect. And a surprising amount of leftist theorists recognise this means-end relationships, except for when it comes to violence, non-violence. And there are certain ways that they get around that, so I'm going to talk about 4 of them. The first is that violence is argued as being necessary or productive. The second is violence is talked of as being inspirational. The third is violence is seen as good because it increases class consciousness. And the fourth is violence is seen as good because it's liberating or freeing. And not all leftists accept all of these, but those are the most common I've found in terms of talking about strategy moving forward. So I'll deal with them one at a time. So if it can be shown that there are alternatives to violence that lead to success, then the argument that violence is necessary is nullified. And even if a stronger argument against the necessity of violence can be made if these alternatives have shown to be more successful. And we have a pile of empirical research that's been talked about a lot now that suggests that non-violence has been more successful over the last 100 years. Chenoweth and Stefan say that it's been twice as successful from 1900 to 2006. A variety of people find that non-violence tends to result in more democratic outcomes. These democratic outcomes last longer, and this might partly be because non-violent movements tend to be more decentralized in their organizing processes. Even when they fail, non-violent movements are more likely to produce democratic outcomes than successful violent movements. Chenoweth and Schock also provide evidence that radical flanks, that violent flanks, hinder non-violent movements. So they sit in between the success levels for violence and non-violence, which calls into question kind of anarchist arguments for a diversity of tactics. So there's a book written by Peter Gelderloos that seems to get referenced a lot, where Gelderloos, without really referring to the non-violence literature, claims that violence supports the state. But I think if we look at how non-violence functions, it's clear that's not the case. So the pillars of support model that Gene Sharp provides shows how non-violence works, and he says that any government, state, regime is held up by pillars, which is about different pillars of people, the police, the army, the media, workers who do certain things, and through these people doing these tasks and these behaviours allow a regime to have its power. And any movement that wants to remove a regime has to either break these pillars or bring them over to their side. And what we're seeing with the non-violence research is non-violence seems to be more often effective at doing this. The next argument is that violence is inspirational, and I think there's 2 parts of this. The first is an argument for terrorism, which was, I think, is an historical argument, especially within anarchism. Anarchists tend to reject this from about 1900 onwards, and a lot of them didn't even accept it in the first place. But the other part is to do with the image of the violent revolutionary. So the inspiration from violence, I don't think it's a logical process. Well, not always. It's about how leftists sometimes see revolutionary figures. So, in brief, I say identify 3 images of the violent revolutionary here, and when I say images, I mean mental images as well as physical images. The first is of the revolutionary martyr, and this image is often bloodless. It portrays dead revolutionaries as glorious, rather than dead revolutionaries as a tragedy. And this does 2 things. It encourages others to do the same act in the future, and it also discourages the analysis of whether violence is effective or not effective. Secondly, romantic views of the violent revolutionary often come from the uneven odds when the revolutionary takes on the state. So this is like the David versus Goliath underdog scenario, and we see that in multiple places. We can see that in non-violence, so for example the man standing in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square. But here, violence is connected into that being in that underdog position. The third is what April Carter calls Diosian violence, which is a spontaneous, irrational violence where someone breaks free from a controlling environment and therefore express their freedom. And to question these acts of violence is then equated to imposing bourgeois morality on somebody who has broken free. So all of these mental processes mean that it can sometimes make it difficult for the nature of violence to be taken seriously and the possibility of non-violence to be taken seriously. So from looking at violence and non-violent revolutions over the last century, we can say in general that people are not as inspired to join violent movements as they are non-violent movements. The participation levels are much higher in non-violent movements. And this is credited as being one of the reasons that violence is less successful than non-violence. Violence seems to create a whole load of barriers to participation. And this leads on nicely to the next argument, which is, my understanding is links back to Sorel in Reflections on Violence, that violence increases class consciousness. And it may be true that being violent together creates a solidarity within that violent group who are using violence. But a problem here is violent groups tend to isolate themselves from the rest of society. And I think it's questionable whether those groups using violence therefore create a class consciousness across society. And the other part here is I think participating in non-violence also does the same thing. It creates a solidarity between people. And if we can say that more people can participate from a bigger range of places in society, then maybe that's going to create more solidarity. Finally, there's the argument that violence is a liberating act for the oppressed. So this comes from Fanon, who prescribes violence as a cure. Here, killing the oppressor releases the oppressed. And this doesn't engage with a pile of research on the effects of killing, which is traumatizing. It's also unnatural. People have to be trained to kill quite intensively. And historically, a lot of cultures have had to create ways to deal with the devastating effects of violence, for example, through washing ceremonies, or ways of stepping away from the horrific acts that they've either been involved in or experienced to be able to engage in their normal life with people. I think it's important to point out that some scholars say if you replace violence for force in Fanon, it creates quite a different reading, and Barbara Deming is one of those who Richard talked about before. And if read this way, liberation can be achieved through non-violent resistance, and it changes Fanon's argument quite a lot, I think. So this leads me on to some conclusions. It's important to note that in some of these conversations there's definitely a confusion between the terms force, coercion and violence. And I think yes, force needs to be generated, but the point here is it can be done non-violently, and a lot of, I'm talking in the space of Western leftist movements, that's not normally considered. Or it is considered, but not explicitly, so they'll recognise, say, the importance of the general strike, which is a non-violent act, but then they don't think of it in those terms. So the argument for non-violence is certainly not an argument for being passive. And also, to be fair to some of these people writing who I'm referring to, especially the late 1800s, early 1900s, their arguments were being used before a time when we'd actually seen mass revolutionary non-violence on the scale we saw with Gandhi in India. Ultimately, my conclusion is that violence can't be revolutionary. It's uncreative. It ignores the nature of violence. It ignores and makes excuses to get around the relationship between means and ends, a relationship it generally realises outside of the violence non-violence argument. It ignores the evidence of non-violence, theory and practice, and as a result, leftist strategy that accepts violence runs the dual risk of creating more violence in many forms and also in just choosing ineffective strategy. So I'll finish by quoting, coming back to Bookchin and the last line of his Listen Marxist argument paper, but I'll replace the word Marxist with leftist. And I do this because the root of the problem here is the same root that Bookchin is arguing against. Our actions constitute our movements, ourselves, and what we create. And if we believe this, if we agree with Bookchin's insight, then the left has to reject violence as it looks to the future. So, listen, leftist. The organisation we try to build is the kind of society our revolution will create. Either we will shed the past in ourselves as well as our groups, or there will simply be no future to win. Thank you.